The prison gate opened with a long metallic screech, like the world was reluctant to hand me back. I stepped out, gripping my small bag of belongings, trying to believe I was actually free. For months, I told myself that what happened that day was my own carelessness, a signature in the wrong place, a rushed decision, one weak moment that cost me 3 years of my life. I still believed that, until the world hit me for the first time. A man was waiting just ahead. Dark suit, a thin stack of papers in his hand, the look of someone who didn't want to be there. He confirmed my name, avoided my eyes, then said it in a voice that never wavered. "Your husband, Daniel, has passed away." I froze, not because it hurt, but because he said it so fast, so neatly, like it was some piece of paperwork that didn't belong to anyone. I asked again, mechanically, not sure I wanted to hear the answer. He just read a few dry details. No funeral. Everything had already been taken care of. Taken care of. No one uses that phrase for a person's death, especially the death of the only husband of a woman who just walked out of prison. He handed me a few papers and left right away, like staying one more second might drag him into a secret that wasn't his. I watched him go, feeling like the world had kicked me out of one cell only to shove me into another, bigger, colder, and much quieter. I rented a car to go home. Through the tinted window, I caught my reflection. Thinner, eyes hollow, nothing like the woman I used to be. The woman in the glass didn't believe in accidents, misfortune, or mistakes anymore. She knew those things were often just a cover for a different story. The house appeared at the end of the quiet street. I used to think seeing it again would make my chest tighten with longing, but it didn't. The first thing I felt was numbness. The front door looked untouched the whole time I'd been gone. No wreath, no sign of anyone visiting, no trace of grief, just cold. I put the key in. The door opened too easily. The living room lit up as sunlight slipped through the window. And right then, I saw what sent a chill straight through me. The house was too clean, too neat. Not the kind of neat someone creates by tidying up, but the kind that happens when someone has erased every trace of themselves. I stepped inside. No coat of Daniel's, no pair of shoes he used to kick into a corner after work, no familiar scent of his cologne. The important things, the ones Daniel always carried with him, were gone. Completely. But the things that didn't matter, old books, a few useless decorations, the broken desk lamp, all still in their places like no one had bothered to touch them. This wasn't the home of someone who had died. It was the home of someone who had left. I opened the desk drawer. The paperwork was arranged too neatly, but buried in it was an uncomfortable truth. Daniel had moved almost all the assets under my name, the savings account, the shares, even this house, out of my ownership before the day I was arrested. I flipped through page after page. The dates didn't need anyone to analyze them. The pattern was obvious. The biggest transfer showed up exactly 1 week before the arrest warrant was carried out. There was no way that was a coincidence. I felt like I was reading the real sentence handed to me. Not the one in court, but the one Daniel had been quietly writing all along. A sentence where I was the main character, but never told the script. I remembered something he once said on a night I'll never forget. If one day I disappear, trust that it's because of us. That day, I thought it was a declaration of love, a promise that he'd protect me from whatever life threw at us. But standing in this spotless house that felt scrubbed clean of everything, his words came back like a warning, a preparation, something intentional. I sat down, my hand resting on the cold papers. Daniel wasn't dead. He had just erased himself from my life, and he did it by sending me to a place where no one would believe anything I said anymore. The first feeling wasn't anger. It wasn't pain. It was heaviness. So heavy I could barely breathe. I looked around the house again. Every empty space said the same thing. Daniel didn't disappear because of tragedy. He disappeared because of preparation. He'd been paving his escape for a long time. He pushed me out first, then took everything I'd ever built. His death, the cold announcement, the spotless house, the vanished assets didn't close the past. It opened another door. A door leading to a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to face. I stood in the middle of the house, still holding the stack of papers Daniel had left unfinished. A strange feeling crept over me. Not loss, but the sense that whatever was waiting out there was more dangerous than the shadow of a man who had died. And that instinct told me one thing very clearly. Daniel had never left this story. He only made me think he did, so I wouldn't see the rest, the part he didn't want anyone to know. The feeling that Daniel had never really left this story made the air in the house feel thick, and I knew that if I wanted the truth, I had to retrace every place Daniel had stood, the people who once called him a friend, the relationships I once thought were harmless. All of them had become doors I needed to open. I started with the person closest to him. When I showed up at Mark's doorstep, he opened the door only halfway, just enough for me to see the uneasiness in his eyes. He didn't hug me or congratulate me for being free. The first thing he did was glance side to side, like he was afraid someone might see me standing there. When I asked about Daniel, Mark froze. There was no grief, no sadness over a man who had supposedly died. He just scratched lightly at the back of his neck and let out a single line. He left. That's all I know. Left. Not a hint of the word died. I looked straight at him, waiting for an explanation. But Mark avoided my eyes just like the man who delivered the news at the prison. He added a few more lines, short, scattered, full of unnatural pauses. The story he told about Daniel felt like a film with half the scenes cut out. I left with a weight in my chest that felt like stone. The second person I went to was Hannah, someone who used to be close to my family. Hannah opened the door and stared at me for a long moment, like she didn't know how she was supposed to react. When I mentioned Daniel, her expression shifted. Not sadness, not shock. It was the kind of avoidance people use when they don't want to be pulled into something they no longer consider their business. What happened between you two? It was complicated, she said, her voice dropping. Complicated. A word so light it felt insulting next to the 3 years I spent locked behind 4 walls. I asked directly, did Daniel ever mention me? Hannah pressed her lips together. He wasn't around anymore. Once again, no one said he died. Everyone talked like he had just stepped out of their lives. I studied Hannah carefully, and in the split second when her eyes slipped out of sync with her words, I saw something no amount of silence could hide. She knew more than she was willing to say. I left Hannah's house and let all their unfinished sentences stitch themselves together in my head. Both of them avoided my eyes. Both of them didn't want to talk about Daniel. And both said the same thing in different ways. Daniel wasn't gone. He chose to leave. The question was, who did he leave with? When I reopened my bank account, that question got an answer faster than I expected. The outgoing transfers stood out sharp, like knife marks. The right dates, the right timing. Exactly when Daniel knew I wouldn't be able to defend myself. The biggest transfer disappeared right before I was arrested. The recipient was hidden behind a string of meaningless characters. But the transaction history that followed showed smaller amounts going to the same account, then to a name I'd never heard before, Renee Simmons. I clicked into the transaction details. The transfer frequency spiked right after I went to prison, then climbed even more in the final months before the day Daniel died. I felt my hand clench without realizing it. Renee wasn't just someone Daniel got involved with. She was the center of the orbit he built while I was locked away, an orbit with money, Daniel's presence, and a life I had no place in. I remembered how Daniel used to talk about second chances. His voice was gentle, like he was talking about a dream. No one deserves to stay stuck in a life they didn't choose, he said. Back then, I thought he was giving me advice. Now, I see it was an excuse he was giving himself. Daniel wasn't afraid of losing his freedom. He was afraid of being tied to a life that still had me in it. The things he said, the light touches, the reassurances I once thought came from love, they all carried the tone of a man looking for an exit, not someone trying to hold on. And when I looked at the timeline of those transactions, everything lined up with a kind of order that was terrifying. Every move Daniel made was part of a plan. Every step he took was toward a life without me. I understood that fully when I found a thin document tucked between the papers he left behind. It wasn't financial paperwork. It was a house purchase agreement. The house listed under the name Renee Simmons, paid for with my money. What I felt wasn't shock. It was a cold that sank straight into my bones. Daniel didn't leave me. He wiped me out of his life. And worse, he started a new life with someone else while I sat in prison for a crime he set up. I didn't say it out loud, but the answer rose anyway. He didn't just abandon me. He eliminated me, clean, neat, without a trace. I set all the papers down on the table and took a long breath. The tension pressed into my chest like someone was pushing in with both hands. It wasn't panic. It was a kind of clarity that made my skin crawl. Everything Daniel used to say, the things I once thought were meant to comfort me, now looked like tiny knives he'd planted, slowly and steadily. He didn't want to be stuck. He wanted to be free of me. And he chose the most absolute way to do it, turning me into the criminal so he could walk away clean. I leaned against the edge of the table, eyes fixed on the empty space where our wedding photo used to hang. I saw a young woman smiling in my memory. She had no idea she was living next to someone who could map out her future down to the week, down to each transfer of money. And when I fit all the pieces together, the dodged answers, the other woman, the missing money, the strange shifts in paperwork, I finally understood what my heart had been trying to block out since the moment I stepped back into this house. Daniel didn't disappear from my life. He erased me from his. I wasn't just abandoned. I was chosen to be removed. And in the moment I understood that, the story shifted. It was no longer about finding a man who had died. It was about facing the truth he left behind. Layer by layer, I stood up, feeling the weight of it fill my chest. Daniel didn't just leave me. He planned for me to disappear. Realizing he had removed me like an excess piece in his life made the space around me tighten. Not because I wanted to run, but because it felt like someone was watching. A small presence, quiet but constant, like a pair of eyes following every step I took in this house. I spotted that gaze from across the street. A little girl stood by the fence, her small hands clasped together, her eyes fixed on me longer than any normal glance. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't fear. It was something I recognized instantly, knowing something but too afraid to say it. Her name, I learned later, was Lily. The next day she was there again, a little closer, a little quieter, as if waiting to see whether I'd notice her presence this time. When I opened the door and stepped onto the porch, her eyes froze. Her small shoulders drew in like she was ready to run, but she didn't. I called out softly, "Are you looking for someone?" Lily shook her head, but she didn't look away from me. Her eyes said more than the words she wouldn't speak, the eyes of someone carrying a secret heavier than her small body. I didn't push her. I just stood there, keeping enough distance so she wouldn't be scared. Lily looked at me once more, then turned away, her steps light but not hurried. She knew. Not about me. She knew about Daniel. One afternoon, Lily stood in my front yard, not behind the fence anymore, not hiding in the shadows. Her eyes no longer darted away. They looked like they decided it was time to say something she'd kept for too long. I opened the door. She stepped forward once, her hands twisting together. "You? You're Mr. Daniel's wife, right?" she asked, her voice small like she was afraid her words might cause something to happen. I nodded. Lily swallowed, then looked down at the ground. "I saw him." I didn't react right away. The calm in me came from the fact that I'd already felt this coming the moment I stepped into that suspiciously spotless house. "When did you see him?" I asked. Lily answered, "After the day people said he died." The words fell softly but cut like glass. I knelt so I was at her eye level. "Are you sure it was him?" Lily nodded hard. "I saw him twice. No, 3 times. She lifted her hand and pointed toward the alley leading to the main road. "He was standing there, looking at your house, but he didn't go in." The picture formed in my mind as clearly as a scene in a movie. Daniel standing in the dark, watching his old life to see if every trace had been wiped clean, not stepping inside, not daring to, not able to. I asked, "Did you talk to him?" Lily nodded again, but slower this time, like each word might stir something dangerous. "He told me I wasn't allowed to tell anyone, especially not you." A cold rush went down my spine. Daniel knew I'd come looking for him. He feared that. Feared it enough to warn a child. "Did you see him with anyone?" I asked directly. Lily bit her lip, then said, "There was a woman. She went with him twice. I think they were really close." My heartbeat didn't speed up. It just grew heavier. I already knew her name from the papers he left behind, Renee Simmons. But hearing it confirmed by a child made everything shift from suspicion to something solid, something undeniable. Lily went on. "He said, when everything's finished, he's going to marry her." The words dropped like a stone into water that was trying to stay still. It didn't crash. It tightened. Daniel didn't just start a new life after I went to prison. He treated my disappearance as the requirement for him to be free enough to love her in the open. "Did you hear him say anything else?" I asked. Lily nodded again. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "He said, if everything falls apart, he won't have anywhere left to go. No place to go." That wasn't something a man confident in his plan would say. It was something a man would say when he knew he was living inside a shell so thin that the smallest crack would expose everything underneath. Daniel wasn't afraid of being caught. He was afraid of being seen for who he really was. When Lily left, I stood on the porch for a long time. The tightness in my chest felt like an invisible rope pulling the air around me taut. No cars, no voices, just emptiness, and the truth growing larger inside it. Daniel was alive. Daniel wasn't living alone. Daniel chose to make me the sacrifice so he could free himself. And now, the truth wasn't surfacing because I was good at finding it. It was surfacing because he was worse at hiding it than he thought. The real twist wasn't that he was alive. The twist was this: if he was alive, then he was living in fear. Fear of me getting out. Fear of his lover asking questions. Fear of the pieces lining up. Fear of the story he built turning on him. Daniel faked his death for 3 reasons, and now they stood out so clearly it almost felt cruel. To take everything I had left. To end our marriage without a stain on him. To legitimize his new life with his lover. With me erased from the picture. And what he didn't plan for was this: the truth isn't a loyal accomplice. It always finds a way to rise. I stood up straight, and the feeling in my chest wasn't pain or anger anymore. It was the clarity of someone who finally sees what's underneath. I didn't need to look for Daniel anymore. I didn't need to dig through relationships or paperwork. I didn't need to chase his shadow. The truth was coming on its own, and every step it moved forward pushed Daniel further into the corner he built for himself. I looked toward the alley, where Lily had seen him standing. No one was there, but I could feel the shift in the story. It wasn't in my hands anymore. The truth was tightening. And Daniel was running out of places to hide. The silence after Lily left didn't fade. It kept gathering in the air. It wasn't the quiet of an empty house anymore. It was the stillness you feel when the door to a hidden room swings open. No sound, but everything shifts. I wasn't searching for Daniel anymore. I just stood where I was and let the truth move toward me. And it moved fast. I spread all the documents across the table, the papers Daniel left behind, the copies of my bank accounts, the details I'd only skimmed before. Now every word, every transfer, every date shouted the same story. Daniel began leaving my life long before I ever realized it. The first piece was right at the time of my conviction. The large sums withdrawn before the day I was arrested were no longer coincidences. They were signs he already knew what was coming. He didn't just know, he prepared for it. That money went into an intermediate account, then slipped into another one under his lover's name. Renee's name appeared again and again, not by accident, but as the center of a blueprint. I traced the timeline again. The day I was arrested, the money disappeared. The months I was in prison, the transfers kept coming, steady and deliberate. The day Daniel died, the final transfer appeared, like the period at the end of the story he wanted to write. And more convenient than coincidence, the day he died was the same day Renee registered the purchase of a small house in the suburbs, paid for with that exact sum. A house where, according to Lily, Daniel had been seen with her. That wasn't a death. It was the quiet debut of a new family. I leaned back in the chair, hands resting on the stack of papers like I was holding the evidence of a carefully crafted crime. In my head, Lily's words lined up into a single, unbroken line. He said when everything's finished, he's gonna marry her. He said if everything falls apart, he won't have anywhere left to go. He said, don't let her know. Afraid I'd know. Afraid I'd get out. Afraid the thing he thought he'd buried would rise up again. Daniel staged his death so he could become the poor man whose wife went to prison, and from there, he slipped out of every responsibility without anyone questioning him. Society pitied him. Friends pitied him. His lover pitied him. A lonely, wounded man, starting over. Daniel knew one thing well. No one wants to hurt someone who looks like they've already lost everything. But what he didn't account for was that the truth isn't a volunteer, it's a digger. And now it's digging straight into his foundation. Daniel was no longer in control of his lover. I knew that not from gossip, but from a small detail buried in Renee's account. The transfers from Daniel slowly decreased, then stopped altogether. A week later, Renee's account started pulling out odd amounts, withdrawals the kind of man Daniel would never let anyone else touch if he were still in charge. Renee had started to suspect him. And when a woman begins to suspect, it's not the man who usually stays standing. From someone I had never met, I suddenly saw the outline of another woman. Someone beginning to realize the man she loved wasn't a victim, but the architect of a tragedy designed to win her sympathy. The people who once covered for Daniel were starting to pull away. Mark didn't open the door for me a second time. Hannah left a message. Don't come here again. To them, Daniel wasn't someone who needed protecting anymore. He was a bomb that would explode if they got too close. The man who calculated every step, every transfer, every word was now being quietly pushed aside by the very people who once shielded him. And that isolation wasn't loud. It was the kind of silence someone like Daniel fears most, the silence that leaves him with no one to lean on. He had no allies left, and the new life he built was no longer stable. I kept going through the documents Daniel used to build his new identity. At first, everything looked smooth, a clean alias, neat records, a freshly opened bank account. But the closer I looked, the more cracks appeared. Some documents were rejected for verification. One account was temporarily frozen. A request for confirmation had no response at all. Daniel's false identity was no longer holding up. And when the fake life collapses, he can't return to the real one. He's trapped between two worlds, and neither will take him back. That's the first price he's paying. Not the police, not me. It's the shell he built that's tightening around him, little by little. I rested my hands on the table and took a long breath. And I realized the most important thing since all of this began. I didn't need to find Daniel. I didn't need to track him. I didn't need to expose him. The truth was moving at its own pace. It didn't ask whether I was ready. It just moved exactly where it needed to go, toward the man who created it. I wasn't the one pushing Daniel into a corner. Daniel did that himself when he assumed I'd disappear forever behind the prison gates. My pain, my humiliation, the years I spent locked away, Daniel treated all of it as building material for the life he wanted. But that material wasn't strong, and I no longer stood in the role of the victim keeping his story alive. I got to my feet. The house was so quiet, I could hear my own breathing. Every corner, every sheet of paper, every word Lily had said, they all pointed to one conclusion. Daniel hadn't fallen yet, but he had no way back. Behind him was the past he tried to bury. In front of him was the lover who had begun to doubt him. On both sides were the people who once backed him now pulling away. Above him was a false identity starting to crack. And under him was a foundation built on lies. He was standing on ground that could no longer hold his weight. And for the first time since I left prison, I felt something like real calm. Not because he was collapsing, but because I finally understood. I didn't need him to fall for me to find myself again. The truth is, its own verdict. And that verdict had already begun speaking Daniel's name. I didn't know exactly where Daniel was when the truth started tightening around him, but I didn't need to know. A man who lives in the dark will always meet that darkness again, not through an enemy, through the things he tried to hide. I only saw the traces of his collapse through scattered bits of information, just enough to understand that Daniel's life was evaporating the same way he once erased me from his. His lover, Renee, was the first to leave. I heard it through someone who used to know her. A big argument, the sound of things breaking, then silence. No one knew what happened inside the house he bought with my money. But everyone knew one thing. Renee walked out with the look of someone who had just seen something unforgivable. She vanished from Daniel's life as quickly as Daniel vanished from mine. No explanation, no glance back. This time, he was the one being left behind. The assets Daniel took from me were frozen right after I submitted the paperwork and the evidence Lily had unknowingly provided. Every transfer matched by date, by amount. There was nowhere to deny it. No gap he could slip through. The law didn't need to know whether Daniel was alive or dead. The money trail told the story he tried to hide. And when the money slipped out of his hands, Daniel lost the only thing that kept his fake life standing: control. A man like Daniel is only strong when he has an escape route. When every escape turns to dust, that strength becomes nothing but an empty shell. The people who once covered for him began turning away one by one, not because they pitied me, not because they found their conscience, but because they were starting to fear Daniel would drag them down with him. Unfinished messages, calls no one picked up, avoided looks when his name came up. Daniel had become the thing everyone wanted to stay away from, a secret too dangerous to keep. No one stood with him. No one played accomplice. No one believed a word he said anymore. Isolation is the cruelest sentence for someone who once believed he could control everything. I went back to see Lily, not to confirm more details, not to ask for anything else. I just wanted to give her back what she had helped me find, a sense of normal. She was sitting on her front steps, legs swinging lightly. When I walked up, she looked up at me. No fear, no hesitation. "Are you okay?" Lily asked, her voice small but honest. I smiled. "I'm okay, and I wanted to thank you." Lily tilted her head, a little confused. "For telling you about him?" "For everything you said," I told her, "not to expose anyone. It let me know I wasn't crazy, that what I felt was real." Lily's eyes brightened a little. Maybe she didn't grasp the full weight of my words, but she understood she'd just been freed from a secret that never should have been hers. I set my hand gently on her shoulder. "You did something adults don't always have the courage to do. You told the truth." I left before she had to carry any feelings that didn't belong to her. The house was the last thing I needed to let go of. Not because it held painful memories, but because it held nothing of mine anymore. The walls were still there, the furniture still in place, but the only thing covering that home was the darkness Daniel left behind. Not the darkness of absence, the darkness of betrayal. I walked through it slowly, not to remember, not to mourn, just to look one last time at a place I once believed was safe. A belief that was wrong but sincere, and because of that, releasing it made me lighter. I locked the door, set the key on the step, and took nothing with me except my own breath. I wasn't leaving the house. I was leaving the old story. The story where Daniel was the center and I was the shadow he controlled. On the way out, I felt something shift in my chest. Not satisfaction, not victory. It was the opening of a clean, honest space, the kind only people willing to live truthfully dare to face. I understood then that the price Daniel was paying wasn't a gift to me. I wasn't waiting for him to fall. I wasn't hoping he'd hurt. I wasn't celebrating the loss of everything he'd built. That price existed to return the three things he took from me: the truth, my freedom, the right to lift my head and keep going. I didn't need an apology. I didn't need an explanation. I didn't need him to face me. I needed the truth. And the truth finally stood on my side. When the road opened in front of me, I walked without looking back, not because I was strong, not because I had forgotten. I didn't turn around because what lay behind me was a story already closed, a story no longer worthy of my face inside it. I walked forward because I had outgrown it, and that was the only victory I needed. The truth always takes its price, and the person who chooses to live honestly, even late, even hurt, even scarred, is always the one who ends up free.